She was lying on a plastic hospital mattress that made a crinkling sound every time she tried to breathe, and my mother was arguing with a billing clerk about insurance coverage while my sister stood near the window, whispering into her phone about liquidating non-essential assets. And I didn't understand what that meant until I saw my grandmother's gold bangles, the ones she'd worn since she was 16, gone from her wrists, and her purse missing from the metal chair beside her bed, and when I asked where her things were, my sister smiled that polished, camera-ready smile and said, "We're just organizing finances, don't make this harder than it already is," like my grandmother's life was an inconvenience on a spreadsheet, and the nurse avoided eye contact when I asked why a woman who had survived wars, recessions, childbirth without anesthesia, and 125 years of living was suddenly listed as do not resuscitate, and my father signed a document without reading it, and I watched my grandmother's eyes, the same eyes that had watched me take my first steps, fill with a kind of quiet terror I'd never seen before, not fear of death but fear of abandonment, and when she reached for my hand she whispered, "They said I'm costing too much," and my chest felt like it was splitting open. And I realized the people who taught me what family meant had just decided she was an expense to be minimized, a problem to be solved, a story to be closed, and when my sister leaned close to her and said, softly, sweetly, "It's okay, Grandma, you've lived long enough," I tasted blood because I'd bitten my tongue to stop from screaming, and that was the moment I knew, the real revenge begins now. If you're drawn to intense, true-feeling stories of betrayal, revenge, and justice that cuts deep, make sure you subscribe to this channel. These stories only get darker from here. I didn't plan revenge like people do in movies, with corkboards and red string and dramatic music. I planned it the way a drowning person plans it, slowly, desperately, one breath at a time, sitting beside my grandmother's bed in that grey hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and old fear, watching machines blink like indifferent stars while rain streaked down the window and the city moved on without us, taxis hissing over wet asphalt, neon signs bleeding color into puddles, and she kept apologizing for being a burden, apologizing for needing help to sit up, apologizing for existing, and every apology carved something sharp into me, something that didn't feel like anger at first but like clarity, like cold water on a burn, because I finally understood that the cruelty wasn't loud, it was administrative, it wore blazers and spoke in polite tones, it hid behind phrases like quality of life and financial responsibility. And my sister, my elegant, charity gala attending, perfectly groomed sister, was the conductor of it all, orchestrating asset transfers, convincing my parents that grandma's accounts should be managed, that property titles should be simplified, that trusts should be restructured, and they listened because she spoke the language of power and I spoke the language of emotion, and emotion doesn't win in boardrooms. I'm 36, I have twins who still think monsters live in closets, and I learned that year that real monsters live in family group chats and legal documents, and I remember the night my grandmother squeezed my fingers with surprising strength and said she didn't want to wake up anymore, that the darkness inside her head felt heavier than her body, and I leaned so close my forehead touched hers and I said, "Nothing will happen, I'm here," even though I didn't know yet what here would require of me, only that it would cost something, maybe everything. The recording happened by accident, the way truth often does. I had left my phone on the bedside tray while helping Grandma sip water, and when I stepped into the hallway to take a call from my son's school, my sister came in, heels clicking like a metronome of control, and she didn't know the screen had brushed against the record button, didn't know the microphone was open, didn't know the universe had finally tilted an inch in our favor, and later that night, in my car in the hospital parking garage that smelled of oil and damp concrete, I played it back and heard her voice stripped of performance, flat and irritated, saying, "Once she's gone, the Queen's property liquidates, the vintage bonds clear, and we move the funds before she changes anything, she's not mentally stable enough to fight it anyway," and my father's voice, tired and small, saying, "Are we sure this is legal?" and my sister laughing softly, "Legal is flexible when paperwork is signed," and my mother whispering, "Just make sure she doesn't talk to that other granddaughter." Alone, and I sat there shaking, not from shock but from confirmation, because doubt is heavier than truth, and now I had truth. Revenge, I learned, is not about explosion, it's about erosion. I didn't confront them. I didn't yell. I brought soup to the hospital, braided my grandmother's hair, helped her sit by the window when the sun came out, and quietly started asking questions in places my sister didn't think I knew existed, probate offices, bank compliance departments, An old lawyer my grandfather used to play chess with in a park in Brooklyn before his knees gave out. Grandpa had always been quiet, the kind of man people mistook for passive, but when I played him the recording in his dim living room that smelled like mothballs and history, his jaw tightened in a way I'd never seen, and he said, "Your sister forgets who taught me to read contracts," and suddenly I wasn't alone. We didn't move fast. We moved precisely. Grandpa still had authority on a contingency clause no one had activated, a dormant oversight role in a trust my sister assumed was symbolic, and with one signature, properly witnessed, properly filed, he froze the transfer pipeline she'd been building, like turning off a hidden valve, and she didn't notice at first because her world was loud and visible and ours was quiet and procedural. Meanwhile, I made sure Grandma had moments of light, my twins drawing pictures at her bedside, old jazz playing softly from my phone, stories about her childhood she'd told me 100 times and I asked to hear again, because memory is a form of resistance, and slowly, the fog in her eyes thinned, not because life was easy but because someone had chosen her without calculation. My sister sensed something before she understood it. Invitations stopped arriving. A charity board seat she'd been promised was reconsidered. A business partner delayed a deal citing unresolved documentation issues. She called me one night, voice silk over steel, asking if I'd been talking to people, and I said, truthfully, just family, and let the silence do the rest. Psychological warfare isn't threats, it's uncertainty. It's watching someone powerful realize the ground answers to someone else now. The final confrontation wasn't in a warehouse with guns, it was in a glass boardroom 30 floors above Manhattan, rain painting the windows, the city smeared into abstraction behind us, where my sister had gathered investors to finalize a consolidation she thought would cement her control. And Grandpa came too, in his old suit that still held its shape, and my parents sat rigid at the far end of the table, looking like people who had boarded the wrong train and were only just noticing the destination, and when the discussion turned to asset authority, Grandpa slid a folder across the table with hands that didn't shake, and inside were the reactivated clauses, the freezes, the reversals, and my sister's smile faltered for the first time in her adult life. She tried to pivot, to charm, to intimidate, and that's when I placed my phone on the polished table and pressed play, and her own voice filled the room, crisp through the speaker, talking about mental instability, about moving funds before my grandmother could change anything, about legality being flexible, and you could feel the air leave the room, feel reputations recalculating in real time, investors seeing not a visionary but a liability, my parents hearing, perhaps for the first time, the full shape of what they'd allowed, and my sister looked at me not with anger but with disbelief, as if empathy had been a card she didn't know I possessed. There was no shouting. Just consequences. Quiet and absolute. Investigations opened. Positions dissolved. Invitations vanished. Money froze in ways money hates to be frozen. My sister's world didn't explode, it imploded, elegantly, efficiently, the way she had tried to fold my grandmother's life into a line item. Grandma never knew the details. She didn't need to. She only knew that the pressure lifted, that the whispers stopped when I entered rooms, that paperwork came back in her name, that her gold bangles returned to her wrists one afternoon when I fastened them and she laughed, surprised by their weight, and she started asking about spring, about sitting in the sun, about my twins' school play, and when she held my face in her paper-thin hands and said, "You kept your promise," I understood revenge wasn't the destruction of my sister, it was the restoration of my grandmother. When Grandma passed, months later, it was in her own bed, sunlight on her blanket, my hand in hers, not in a room where someone was arguing about costs. At the funeral, my sister stood at the edge of the crowd, smaller somehow, not because I'd ruined her but because truth had resized her, and I didn't feel triumph, only a steady, sober quiet, the kind that comes after a storm when you can finally see what's left standing, and what stood was simple. I had said I'm here, and for once in our family, that had meant something irreversible.